Chapter 17. The Storm Breaks. And now it was that the trouble, which at first had been but a cloud as large as a man's hand, began to loom very black and big upon our horizon, namely, Sorais' preference for Sir Henry. I saw the storm drawing nearer and nearer, and so, poor fellow, did he. The affection of so lovely and highly placed a woman was not a thing that could in a general way be considered a calamity by any man, but, situated as Curtis was, it was a grievous burden to bear. To begin with, Nyleptha, though altogether charming, was, it must be admitted, of a rather jealous disposition, and was sometimes apt to visit on her lover's head her indignation at the marks of what Alphonse would have called the distinguished consideration with which her royal sister favoured him. Then the enforced secrecy of his relation to Nyleptha prevented Curtis from taking some opportunity of putting a stop, or trying to put a stop, to this false condition of affairs by telling Sorais, in a casual but confidential way, that he was going to marry her sister. A third sting in Sir Henry's honey was that he knew that Good was honestly and sincerely attached to the ominous-looking but most attractive lady of the night. Indeed, poor Bougwan was wasting himself to a shadow of his fat and jolly self about her, his face getting so thin that his eyeglass would scarcely stick in it, while she, with a sort of careless coquetry, just gave him encouragement enough to keep him going, thinking, no doubt, that he might be useful as a stalking horse. I tried to give him a hint in as delicate a way as I could, but he flew into a huff and would not listen to me. So I was determined to let ill along for fear of making it worse. Poor Good! He really was very ludicrous in his distress, and went in for all sorts of absurdities, under the belief that he was advancing his suit. One of them was the writing, with the assistance of one of the grave and revered seniors who instructed us, and who, whatever may have been the measure of his erudition, did not understand how to scan a line, of a most interminable Zu-Vendi love song, of which the continually recurring refrain was something about "I will kiss thee, oh yes, I will kiss thee." Now among the Zu-Vendi it is a common and most harmless thing for young men to serenade ladies at night, as I believe they do in the southern countries of Europe, and sing all sorts of nonsensical songs to them. The young men may or may not be serious, but no offence is meant and none is taken, even by ladies of the highest rank, who accept the whole thing as an English girl would a gracefully turned compliment. Availing himself of this custom, Good bethought him that would serenade Sorais, whose private apartments, together with those of her maidens, were exactly opposite our own, on the further side of a narrow courtyard which divided one section of the great palace from another. Accordingly, having armed himself with a native zither, on which, being an adept with the light guitar, he had easily learned to strum, he proceeded at midnight, the fashionable hour for this sort of caterwauling, to make night hideous with his amorous yells. I was fast asleep when they began, but they soon woke me up, for Good possesses a tremendous voice and has no notion of time, and I ran to my window place to see what was the matter, and there, standing in the full moonlight in the courtyard, I perceived Good, adorned with an enormous ostrich feather head-dress and a flowing silken cloak, which is the right thing to wear upon these occasions, and shouting out the abominable song which he and the old gentleman had evolved, to a jerky, jingling accompaniment. From the direction of the quarters of the maids of honour came a succession of faint sniggerings, but the apartments of Sorais herself, whom I devoutly pitied if she happened to be there, were silent as the grave. There was absolutely no end to that awful song, with its eternal "I will kiss thee," and at last neither I nor Sir Henry, whom I had summoned to enjoy the sight, could stand it any longer. So, remembering the dear old story, I put my head to the window opening and shouted, "For heaven's sake, Good, don't go on talking about it, but kiss her, and let's all go to sleep." That choked him off, and we had no more serenading. The whole thing formed a laughable incident in a tragic business. How deeply thankful we ought to be that even the most serious matters have generally a silver lining about them in the shape of a joke, if only people could see it. The sense of humour is a very valuable possession in life, and ought to be cultivated in the board schools, especially in Scotland. Well, the more Sir Henry held off, the more Sorais came on, as is not uncommon in such cases, till at last things got very queer indeed. Evidently she was, by some strange perversity of mind, quite blinded to the true state of the case, and I, for one, greatly dreaded the moment of her awakening. Sorais was a dangerous woman to be mixed up with, either with or without one's consent. At last the evil moment came, as I saw it must come. One fine day, Good having gone out hawking, Sir Henry and I were sitting quietly talking over the situation, especially with reference to Sorais, when a court messenger arrived with a written note, which we with some difficulty deciphered, and which was to the effect that the Queen Sorais commanded the attendance of the Lord Incubu in her private apartments, whither he would be conducted by the bearer. "Oh, my word!" groaned Sir Henry. "Can't you go instead, old fellow?" "Not if I know it," I said with vigour. "I had rather face a wounded elephant with a shotgun. Take care of your own business, my boy. If you will be so fascinating, you must take the consequences. I would not be in your place for an empire." "You remind me of when I was going to be flogged at school, and the other boys came to console me," he said gloomily. "What right has this Queen to command my attendance, I should like to know? I won't go." "But you must. You are one of her officers and bound to obey her, and she knows it. And after all, it will soon be over." "That's just what they used to say," he said again. "I only hope she won't put a knife into me." "I believe that she is quite capable of it." And off he started very faint-heartedly, and no wonder. I sat and waited, and at the end of about 45 minutes he returned, looking a good deal worse than when he went. "Give me something to drink," he said hoarsely. I got him a cup of wine and asked what was the matter. "What is the matter? Why, if ever there was trouble, there's trouble now. You know when I left you. Well, I was shown straight into Sorais's private chamber, and a wonderful place it is, and there she sat, quite alone, upon a silken couch at the end of the room, playing gently upon that zither of hers. I stood before her, and for a while she took no notice of me, but kept on playing and singing a little, and very sweet music it was. At last she looked up and smiled. 'So thou art come,' she said. 'I thought perchance thou hadst gone about Queen Nyleptha's business. thou art ever on her business, and I doubt not a good servant and a true." To this I merely bowed, and said I was there to receive the Queen's word. "Ah yes, I would talk with thee, but be thou seated. It wearies me to look so high." And she made room for me beside her on the couch, placing herself with her back against the end, so as to have a view of my face. "It is not meet," I said, "that I should make myself equal with the Queen." "I said be seated," was her answer, so I sat down, and she began to look at me with those dark eyes of hers. There she sat like an incarnate spirit of beauty, hardly talking at all, and when she did, very low, but all the while looking at me. There was a white flower in her black hair, and I tried to keep my eyes on it and count the petals, but it was of no use. At last, whether it was her gaze, or the perfume in her hair, or what, I do not know, but I almost felt as though I was being mesmerized. At last she roused herself. "Incubu," she said, "lovest thou power?" I replied that I supposed all men loved power of one sort or another. "Thou shalt have it," she said. "Lovest thou wealth?" I said I liked wealth for what it bought. "Thou shalt have it," she said. "And lovest thou beauty?" To this I replied that I was very fond of statuary and architecture, or something silly of that sort, at which she frowned, and there was a pause. By this time my nerves were on such a stretch that I was shaking like a leaf. I knew that something awful was going to happen, but she held me under a kind of spell, and I could not help myself. "Incubu," she said at length, "wouldst thou be a king? Listen, wouldst thou be a king? Behold, stranger, I am minded to make thee king of all Zu Vendis, ay, and husband of Sorais of the Night. Nay, peace, and hear me. To no man among my people had I thus opened out my secret heart, but thou art an outlander, and therefore I speak without shame, knowing all I have to offer, and how hard it had been thee to ask. See, a crown lies at thy feet, my lord Incubu, and with that fortune a woman whom some have wished to woo. Now mayest thou answer, O my chosen, and soft shall thy words fall upon mine ears." "O Sorais," I said, "I pray thee speak not thus. You see, I had not time to pick and choose my words. For this thing cannot be. I am betrothed to thy sister Nyleptha, O Sorais, and I love her and her alone." Next moment it struck me that I had said an awful thing, and I looked up to see the results. When I spoke, Sorais' face was hidden in her hands, and as my words reached her she slowly raised it, and I shrank back dismayed. It was ashy white, and her eyes were flaming. She rose to her feet and seemed to be choking, but the awful thing was that she was so quiet about it. Once she looked at a side table on which lay a dagger, and from it to me, as though she thought of killing me, but she did not take it up. At last she spoke one word and one only: "Go." And I went, and glad enough I was to get out of it, and here I am. Give me another cup of wine, there's a good fellow, and tell me what is to be done." I shook my head, for the affair was indeed serious. As one of the poets says, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned," more especially if the woman is a queen and a Sorais, and indeed I feared the very worst including imminent danger to ourselves. "Nyleptha had better be told of this at once," I said, "and perhaps I had better tell her. She might receive your account with suspicion." "Who is captain of the guard tonight?" I went on. "Good. Very well then, there will be no chance of her being got at. Don't look surprised. I don't think that her sister would stick at that. I suppose one must tell Good of what happened." "Oh, I don't know," said Sir Henry. "It would hurt his feelings, poor fellow. You see, he takes a lively personal interest in Sorais." "That's true, and after all perhaps there is no need to tell him. He will find out the truth soon enough. Now you mark my words. Sorais will throw in her lot with Nasta, who is sulking up in the north there, and there will be such a war as has not been known in Zu Vendis for centuries. Look there!" and I pointed to two court messengers who were speeding away from the door of Sorais' private apartments. "Now follow me," and I ran up a stairway into an outlook tower that rose from the roof of our quarters, taking the spyglass with me, and looked out over the palace wall. The first thing we saw was one of the messengers speeding towards the temple, bearing, without any doubt, the Queen's word to the High Priest Agon. But for the other I searched in vain. Presently, however, I spied a horseman riding furiously through the northern gate of the city, and in him I recognized the other messenger. "Ah," I said, "Sorais is a woman of spirit. She is acting at once, and will strike quick and hard. You have insulted her, my boy, and the blood will flow in rivers before the stain is washed away, and yours with it, if she can get hold of you. Well, I'm off to Nyleptha. Just you stop where you are, old fellow, and try to get your nerves straight again. You'll need them all, I can tell you, unless I have observed human nature in the rough for 50 years for nothing." And off I went accordingly. I gained audience of the Queen without trouble. She was expecting Curtis, and was not best pleased to see my mahogany-coloured face instead. "Is there aught wrong with my lord, Macumazahn, that he waits not upon me? Say, is he sick?" I said that he was well enough, and then, without further ado, I plunged into my story, and told it from beginning to end. Oh, what a rage she flew into! It was a sight to see her, she looked so lovely. "How darest thou come to me with such a tale?" she cried. "It is a lie to say that my lord was making love to Sorais, my sister." "Pardon me, O Queen," I answered. "I said that Sorais was making love to thy lord." "Spin me no spider's webs of words. Is not the thing the same thing? The one giveth, the other taketh, but the gift passes, and what matters it which is the most guilty? Sorais! Oh, I hate her! Sorais is a queen, and my sister. She had not stooped so low had he not shown the way. Oh, truly hath the poet said that man is like a snake, whom to touch is poison, and whom none can hold." "The remark, O Queen, is excellent, but methinks thou hast misread the poet. Nyleptha," I went on, "thou knowest well that thy words are empty foolishness, and that this is no time for folly." "How darest thou?" she broke in, stamping her foot. "Hast my false lord sent thee to me to insult me also? Who art thou, stranger, that thou shouldest speak to me, the Queen, after this sort? How darest thou?" "Yea, I dare. Listen, the moments which thou dost waste in idle anger may well cost thee thy crown and all of us our lives. Already Sorais' horsemen go forth and call to arms. In 3 days' time Nasta will rouse himself and his fastnesses like a lion in the evening, and his growling will be heard throughout the north. The lady of the night, Sorais, hath a sweet voice, and she will not sing in vain. Her banner will be borne from range to range and valley to valley, and warriors will spring up in its track like dust beneath a whirlwind. Half the army will echo her war cry, and in every town and hamlet of this wide land the priests will call out against the foreigner, and will preach her cause as holy. I have spoken, O Queen." Nyleptha was quite calm now. Her jealous anger had passed, and putting off the character of a lovely headstrong lady, with a rapidity and completeness that distinguished her, she put on that of a queen and a woman of business. The transformation was sudden but entire. "Thy words are very wise, Macumazahn. Forgive me my folly. Ah, what a queen I should be if only I had no heart. To be heartless, that is to conquer all. Passion is like the lightning. It is beautiful, and it links the earth to heaven, but alas, it blinds. And thou thinkest that my sister Sorais would levy war upon me. So be it. She shall not prevail against me. I too have my friends and my retainers. There are many, I say, who will shout Nyleptha when my pennon runs up on peak and pinnacle, and the light of my beacon fires leaps tonight from crag to crag, bearing the message of my war. I will break her strength and scatter her armies. Eternal night shall be the portion of Sorais of the night. Give me that parchment and the ink. So. Now summon the officer in the ante-room. He is a trusty man." I did as I was bid, and the man, a veteran and quiet-looking gentleman of the guard, named Kara, entered, bowing low. "Take this parchment," said Nyleptha. "It is thy warrant, and guard every place of in and outgoing in the apartments of my sister Sorais, the Lady of the Night, and a Queen of the Zu-Vendi. Let none come in and none go out, or thy life shall pay the cost." The man looked startled, but he merely said, "The Queen's word be done," and departed. Then Nyleptha sent a messenger to Sir Henry, and presently he arrived, looking uncommonly uncomfortable. I thought that another outburst was about to follow, but wonderful are the ways of woman. She said not a word about Sorais and his supposed inconstancy, greeting him with a friendly nod, and stating simply that she required his advice upon high matters. All the same, there was a look in her eye, and a sort of suppressed energy in her manner towards him that makes me think that she had not forgotten the affair, but was keeping it for a private occasion. Just after Curtis arrived, the officer returned, and reported that Sorais was gone. The bird had flown to the temple, stating that she was going, as was sometimes the custom among Zu-Vendi ladies of rank, to spend the night in meditation before the altar. We looked at each other significantly. The blow had fallen very soon. Then we set to work. Generals who could be trusted were summoned from their quarters, and as much of the state affairs as was thought desirable was told to each, strict injunctions being given to them to get all their available force together. The same was done with such of the more powerful lords as Nyleptha knew she could rely on, several of whom left that very day for distant parts of the country to gather up their tribesmen and retainers. Sealed orders were dispatched to the rulers of far-off cities, and some 20 messengers were sent off before nightfall, with instructions to ride early and late till they reached the distant chiefs to whom their letters were addressed. Also many spies were set to work. All the afternoon and evening we laboured, assisted by some confidential scribes, Nyleptha showing an energy and resource of mind that astonished me, and it was 8 o'clock before we got back to our quarters. Here we heard from Alphonse, who was deeply aggrieved because our non-return had spoilt his dinner, for he had turned cook again now, that Good had come back from his hawking and gone on duty. As instructions had already been given to the officer of the outer guard to double the sentries at the gate, and as we had no reason to fear any immediate danger, we did not think it worth while to hunt him up and tell him anything of what had passed, which at best was, under the peculiar circumstances of the case, one of those tasks that one prefers to postpone. So after swallowing our food we turned in to get some much-needed rest. Before we did so, however, it occurred to Curtis to tell old Umslopogaas to keep a lookout in the neighbourhood of Nyleptha's private apartments. Umslopogaas was now well known about the place, and by the Queen's order allowed to pass whither he would by the guards, a permission of which he often availed himself by roaming about the palace during the still hours in the nocturnal fashion that he favoured, and which is by no means uncommon amongst black men generally. His presence in the corridors would not, therefore, be likely to excite remark. Without any comment the Zulu took up his axe and departed, and we also departed to bed. I seemed to have been asleep but a few minutes when I was awakened by a peculiar sensation of uneasiness. I felt that somebody was in the room and looking at me, and instantly sat up, to see to my surprise that it was already dawn, and that there, standing at the foot of my couch and looking peculiarly grim and gaunt in the grey light, was Umslopogaas himself. "How long hast thou been there?" I asked testily, for it is not pleasant to be aroused in such a fashion. "Mayhap the half of an hour, Macumazahn. I have word for thee." "Speak on," I said, now wide enough awake. "As I was bid, I went last night to the place of the White Queen, and hid myself behind a pillar in the second anteroom, beyond which is the sleeping place of the Queen. Bougwan, Good, was in the first anteroom alone, and outside the curtain of that room was a sentry, but I had a mind to see if I could pass in unseen, and I did, gliding behind them both. There I waited for many hours, when suddenly I perceived a dark figure coming secretly towards me. It was the figure of a woman, and in her hand she held a dagger. Behind that figure crept another unseen by the woman. It was Bougwan following in her tracks. His shoes were off, and for so fat a man he followed very well. The woman passed me, and the starlight shone upon her face. "Who was it?" I asked impatiently. The face was the face of the Lady of the Night, and of a truth she is well named. I waited, and Bougwan passed me also. Then I followed. So we went slowly and without a sound up the long chamber. First the woman, then Bougwan, and then I. And the woman saw not Bougwan, and Bougwan saw not me. At last the Lady of the Night came to the curtains that shut off the sleeping place of the White Queen, and put out her left hand to part them. She passed through, and so did Bougwan, and so did I. At the far end of the room is the bed of the Queen, and on it she lay very fast asleep. I could hear her breathe, and see one white arm lying on the coverlid like a streak of snow on the dry grass. The Lady of the Night doubled herself thus, and with the long knife lifted crept towards the bed. So straight did she gaze thereat that she never thought to look behind her. When she was quite close, Bougwan touched her on the arm, and she caught her breath and turned, and I saw the knife flash and heard it strike. Well was it for Bougwan that he had the skin of iron on him, or he had been pierced. Then for the first time he saw who the woman was, and without a word he fell back astonished and unable to speak. She too was astonished and spoke not, but suddenly she laid her finger on her lips, thus, and walked towards and through the curtain, and with her went Bougwan. So close did she pass to me that her dress touched me, and I was nigh to slaying her as she went. In the first outer room she spoke to Bougwan in a whisper, and clasping her hands thus, she pleaded with him, but what she said I know not. And so they passed on to the second outer room, she pleading, and he shaking his head, and saying, "Nay, nay, nay." And it seemed to me that he was about to call the guard, when she stopped talking, and looked at him with great eyes, and I saw that he was bewitched by her beauty. Then she stretched out her hand, and he kissed it, whereon I gathered myself together to advance and take her, seeing that now had Bougwan become a woman, and no longer knew the good from the evil, when behold, she was gone. "Gone?" I ejaculated. "Ay, gone," and there stood Bougwan staring at the wall like one asleep. And presently he went too, and I waited a while, and came away also. "Art thou sure, Umslopogaas," said I, "that thou hast not been a dreamer this night?" In reply he opened his left hand, and produced about 3 inches of a blade of a dagger of the finest steel. "If I be, Macumazahn, behold what the dream left with me." The knife broke upon Bougwan's bosom, and as I passed I picked this up in the sleeping place of the White Queen. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. War. Red War. Telling Umslopogaas to wait, I tumbled into my clothes and went off with him to Sir Henry's room, where the Zulu repeated his story word for word. It was a sight to watch Curtis's face as he heard it. "Great heavens!" he said. "Here have I been sleeping away while Nyleptha was nearly murdered, and all through me too. What a fiend that Sorais must be! It would have served her well if Umslopogaas had cut her down in the act." "Ay," said the Zulu. "Fear not, I should have slain her ere she struck. I was but waiting the moment." I said nothing, but I could not help thinking that many a thousand doomed lives would have been saved if he had meted out to Sorais the fate she meant for her sister, and as the issue proved, I was right. After he had told his tale, Umslopogaas went off unconcernedly to get his morning meal, and Sir Henry and I fell to talking. At first he was very bitter against Good, who, he said, was no longer to be trusted, having designedly allowed Sorais to escape by some secret stair, when it was his duty to have handed her over to justice. Indeed, he spoke in the most unmeasured terms on the matter. I let him run on a while, reflecting to myself how easy we find it to be hard on the weakness of others, and how tender we are to our own. "Really, my dear fellow," I said at length, "one would never think, to hear you talk, that you were the man who had an interview with this same lady yesterday, and found it rather difficult to resist her fascinations, notwithstanding your ties to one of the loveliest and most loving women in the world. Now suppose it was Nyleptha who had tried to murder Sorais, and you had caught her, and she had pleaded with you, would you have been so very eager to hand her over to an open shame and to death by fire? Just look at the matter through Good's eyeglass for a minute before you denounce an old friend as a scoundrel." He listened to this jobation submissively, and then frankly acknowledged that he had spoken hardly. It is one of the best points in Sir Henry's character that he is always ready to admit it when he is in the wrong. But though I spoke up thus for Good, I was not blind to the fact that, however natural his behaviour might be, it was obvious that he was being involved in a very awkward and disgraceful complication. A foul and wicked murder had been attempted, and he had let the murderess escape, and thereby, among other things, allowed her to gain a complete ascendancy over himself. In fact, he was in a fair way to become her tool, and no more dreadful fate can befall a man than to become the tool of an unscrupulous woman, or indeed of any woman. There is but one end to it. When he is broken, or has served her purpose, he is thrown away, turned out on the world to hunt for his lost self-respect. Whilst I was pondering thus, and wondering what was to be done, for the whole subject was a thorny one, I suddenly heard a great clamour in the courtyard outside, and distinguished the voice of Umslopogaas and Alphonse, the former cursing furiously, and the latter yelling in terror. Hurrying out to see what was the matter, I was met by a ludicrous sight. The little Frenchman was running up the courtyard at an extraordinary speed, and after him sped Umslopogaas like a great greyhound. Just as I came out, he caught him, and lifting him right off his legs, carried him some paces to a beautiful but very dense flowering shrub, which bore a flower not unlike the gardenia, but was covered with short thorns. Next, despite his howls and struggles, he with one mighty thrust plunged poor Alphonse head first into the bush, so that nothing but the calves of his legs and heels remained in evidence. Then, satisfied with what he had done, the Zulu folded his arms and stood grimly contemplating the Frenchman's kicks and listening to his yells, which were awful. "What art thou doing?" I said, running up. "Wouldst thou kill the man? Pull him out of the bush." With a savage grunt he obeyed, seizing the wretched Alphonse by the ankle, and with a jerk that must have nearly dislocated it, tearing him out of the heart of the shrub. Never did I see such a sight as he presented, his clothes half torn off his back, and bleeding as he was in every direction from the sharp thorns. There he lay and yelled and rolled, and there was no getting anything out of him. At last, however, he got up, and, ensconcing himself behind me, cursed old Umslopogaas by every saint in the calendar, vowing by the blood of his heroic grandfather that he would poison him and have his revenge. At last I got to the truth of the matter. It appeared that Alphonse habitually cooked Umslopogaas's porridge, which the latter ate for breakfast in the corner of the courtyard, just as he would have done at home in Zululand, from a gourd and with a wooden spoon. Now Umslopogaas had, like many Zulus, a great horror of fish, which he considered a species of water snake. So Alphonse, who was as fond of playing tricks as a monkey, and who was also a consummate cook, determined to make him eat some. Accordingly he grated up a quantity of white fish very finely, and mixed it with the Zulu's porridge, who swallowed it nearly all down in ignorance of what he was eating. But unfortunately for Alphonse, he could not restrain his joy at this sight, and came capering and peering around, till at last Umslopogaas, who was very clever in his way, suspected something, and after a careful examination of the remains of his porridge, discovered the buffalo heifer's trick, and in revenge served him as I have said. Indeed, the little man was fortunate not to get a broken neck for his pains, for as one would have thought, he might have learnt from the episode of his display of axemanship that le Monsieur Noir was an ill person to play practical jokes upon. This incident was unimportant enough in itself, but I narrate it because it led to serious consequences. As soon as he had staunched the bleeding from his scratches and washed himself, Alphonse went off, still cursing, to recover his temper, a process which I knew from experience would take a very long time. When he had gone, I gave Umslopogaas a jobation and told him that I was ashamed of his behaviour. "Ah, well, Macumazahn," he said, "you must be gentle with me, for here is not my place. I am weary of it, weary to death of eating and drinking, of sleeping and giving in marriage. I love not this soft life in stone houses that take the heart out of a man and turn his strength to water and his flesh to fat. I love not the white robes and the delicate women, the blowing of trumpets and the flying of hawks. When we fought the Masai at the kraal yonder, then life was worth the living. But here is never a blow struck in anger, and I begin to think I shall go the way of my fathers and lift Inkosi-kaas no more." And he held up the axe and gazed at it in sorrow. "Ah," I said, "that is thy complaint, is it? Thou hast the blood sickness, hast thou? And the woodpecker wants a tree. And at thy age, too. Shame on thee, Umslopogaas." "Ay, Macumazahn, mine is a red trade, yet it is better and more honest than some. Better is it to slay a man in fair fight than to suck out his heart's blood in buying and selling and usury after your white fashion. Many a man have I slain, yet is there never a one that I should fear to look in the face again. Ay, many are there who once were friends, and whom I should be right glad to snuff with. But there, thou hast thy ways and I mine, each to his own people and his own place. The high veldt ox will die in the fat bush country, and so it is with me, Macumazahn. I am rough, I know it, and when my blood is warm, I know not what to do, but yet wilt thou be sorry when the night swallows me, and I am utterly lost in blackness. For in thy heart thou lovest me, my father, Macumazahn the fox, though I be naught but a broken-down Zulu war-dog, a chief for whom there is no room in his own kraal, an outcast and a wanderer in strange places. I love thee, Macumazahn, for we have grown grey together, and there is that between us that cannot be seen, and yet is too strong for breaking." And he took his snuff-box, which was made of an old brass cartridge, from the slit in his ear where he always carried it, and handed it to me for me to help myself. I took the pinch of snuff with some emotion. It was quite true. I was much attached to the bloodthirsty old ruffian. I do not know what was the charm of his character, but it had a charm. Perhaps it was his fierce honesty and directness. Perhaps one admired his almost superhuman skill and strength. Or it may have been simply that he was so absolutely unique. Frankly, with all my experience of savages, I never knew a man quite like him. He was so wise and yet such a child with it all. And though it seems laughable to say so, like the hero of the Yankee parody, he had a tender heart. Anyway, I was very fond of him, though I should never have thought of telling him so. "Ay, old wolf," I said, "thine is a strange love. Thou wouldst split me to the chin if I stood in thy path tomorrow." "Thou speakest truth, Macumazahn. That would I if it came in the way of duty, but I should love thee all the same when the blow had gone fairly home. Is there any chance of some fighting here, Macumazahn?" he went on in an insinuating voice. "Methought that what I saw last night did show that the two great queens were vexed with one another. Else had the Lady of the Night not brought that dagger with her." I agreed with him that it showed that more or less pique and irritation existed between the ladies, and told him how things stood, and that they were quarrelling over Incubu. "Ah, is it so?" he exclaimed, springing up in delight. "Then will there be war as surely as the rivers rise in their rains, war to the end. Women love the last blow as well as the last word, and when they fight for love they are pitiless as a wounded buffalo. See thou, Macumazahn, a woman will swim through blood to her desire, and think naught of it. With these eyes have I seen it once, and twice also. Ah, Macumazahn, we shall see this fine place of houses burning yet, and hear the battle cries come ringing up the street. After all, I have not wandered for nothing. Can this folk fight, think ye?" Just then Sir Henry joined us, and Good arrived too from another direction, looking very pale and hollow-eyed. The moment Umslopogaas saw the latter, he stopped his bloodthirsty talk and greeted him. "Ah, Bougwan," he cried, "greeting to thee, Inkoos. Thou art surely weary. Didst thou hunt too much yesterday?" Then, without waiting for an answer, he went on. "Listen, Bougwan, and I will tell thee a story. It is about a woman, therefore wilt thou hear it, is it not so? There was a man, and he had a brother, and there was a woman who loved the man's brother, and was beloved of the man. But the man's brother had a favourite wife, and loved not the woman, and he made a mock of her. Then the woman, being very cunning and fierce-hearted for revenge, took counsel with herself, and said to the man, 'I love thee, and if thou wilt make war upon thy brother, I will marry thee.' And he knew it was a lie, yet because of his great love of the woman, who was very fair, did he listen to her words, and made war. And when many people had been killed, his brother sent to him, saying, 'Why slayest thou me? What hurt have I done unto thee? From my youth up have I not loved thee? When thou wast little, did I not nurture thee? And have we not gone down to war together, and divided the cattle, girl by girl, ox by ox, and cow by cow? Why slayest thou me, my brother, son of my own mother?' Then the man's heart was heavy, and he knew that his path was evil, and he put aside the tempting of the woman, and ceased to make war on his brother, and lived at peace in the same kraal with him. And after a time the woman came to him and said, 'I have lost the past, I will be thy wife.' And in his heart he knew that it was a lie, and that she thought the evil thing, yet because of his love did he take her to wife. And the very night that they were wed, when the man was plunged into a deep sleep, did the woman arise and take his axe from his hand, and creep into the hut of his brother and slay him in his rest. Then did she slink back like a gorged lioness, and place the thong of the red axe back upon his wrist, and go her ways. And at the dawning the people came shouting, 'Lousta is slain in the night.' And they came unto the hut of the man, and there he lay asleep, and by him was the red axe. Then did they remember the war, and say, Lo, he hath of a surety slain his brother. And they would have taken and killed him, but he rose and fled swiftly, and as he fleeted by, he slew the woman. But death could not wipe out the evil she had done, and on him rested the weight of all her sin. Therefore is he an outcast, and his name a scorn among his own people. For on him, and him only, resteth the burden of her who betrayed. And therefore does he wander afar, without a corral, and without an ox or a wife, and therefore will he die afar like a stricken buck, and his name be accursed from generation to generation, in that the people say that he slew his brother Lusta by treachery in the night time. The old Zulu paused, and I saw that he was deeply agitated by his own story. Presently he lifted his head, which he had bowed to his breast, and went on. I was the man, Bougwan. Oh, I was that man, and now hark thou. Even as I am, so wilt thou be. A tool, a plaything, an ox of burden to carry the evil deeds of another. Listen, when thou didst creep after the Lady of the Night, I was hard upon thy track. When she struck thee with the knife in the sleeping place of the White Queen, I was there also. When thou didst let her slip away like a snake in the stones, I saw thee, and I knew that she had bewitched thee, and that a true man had abandoned the truth, and he who aforetime loved a straight path had taken a crooked way. Forgive me, my father, if my words are sharp, but out of a full heart are they spoken. See her no more, so shalt thou go down with honour to the grave, else because of the beauty of a woman that weareth as a garment of fur, shalt thou be even as I am, and perchance with more cause. I have said. Throughout this long and eloquent address, Good had been perfectly silent. But when the tale began to shape itself so aptly to his own case, he coloured up, and when he learnt that what had passed between him and Sorais had been overseen, he was evidently much distressed. And now when at last he spoke, it was in a tone of humility quite foreign to him. "I must say," he said with a bitter little laugh, "that I scarcely thought that I should live to be taught my duty by a Zulu, but it just shows what we can come to. I wonder if you fellows can understand how humiliated I feel, and the bitterest part of it is that I deserve it all. Of course I should have handed Sorais over to the guard, but I could not, and that is a fact. I let her go, and I promised to say nothing, more is the shame to me. She told me that if I would side with her she would marry me and make me king of this country. But thank goodness I did find the heart to say that even to marry her I could not desert my friends. And now you can do what you like. I deserve it all. All I have to say is that I hope that you may never love a woman with all your heart and then be so sorely tempted of her." And he turned to go. "Look here, old fellow," said Sir Henry, "just stop a minute. I have a little tale to tell you too." And he went on to narrate what had taken place on the previous day between Sorais and himself. This was a finishing stroke to poor Good. It is not pleasant to any man to learn that he has been made a tool of, but when the circumstances are as peculiarly atrocious as in the present case, it is about as bitter a pill as anybody can be called on to swallow. "Do you know," he said, "I think that between you fellows have about worked a cure." And he turned and walked away, and I for one felt very sorry for him. Ah, if the moths would always carefully avoid the candle, how few burnt wings there would be. That day was a court day, when the Queen sat in the great hall and received petitions, discussed laws, money grants, and so forth, and thither we adjourned shortly afterwards. On our way we were joined by Good, who was looking exceedingly depressed. When we got into the hall, Nyleptha was already on her throne and proceeding with business as usual, surrounded by councillors, courtiers, lawyers, priests, and an unusually strong guard. It was, however, easy to see from the air of excitement and expectation on the faces of everybody present that nobody was paying much attention to ordinary affairs, the fact being that the knowledge that civil war was imminent had now got abroad. We saluted Nyleptha and took our accustomed places, and for a little while things went on as usual, when suddenly the trumpets began to call outside the palace, and from the great crowd that was gathered there in anticipation of some unusual event there rose a roar of "Sorais! Sorais!" Then came the roll of many chariot wheels, and presently the great curtains at the end of the hall were drawn wide, and through them entered the Lady of the Night herself. Nor did she come alone. Preceding her was Agon, the High Priest, arrayed in his most gorgeous vestments, and on either side were other priests. The reason for their presence was obvious. Coming with them, it would have been sacrilege to attempt to detain her. Behind her were a number of the great lords, and behind them a small body of picked guards. A glance at Sorais herself was enough to show that her mission was of no peaceful kind, for in place of her gold-embroidered calf she wore a shining tunic formed of golden scales, and on her head a little golden helmet. In her hand, too, she bore a toy spear, beautifully made, and fashioned of solid silver. Up the hall she came, looking like a lioness in her conscious pride and beauty, and as she came the spectators fell back bowing and made a path for her. By the sacred stone she halted, and laying her hand on it she cried out with a loud voice to Nyleptha on the throne, "Hail, O Queen!" "All hail, my royal sister," answered Nyleptha. "Draw thou near, fear not, I give thee safe conduct." Sorais answered with a haughty look, and swept on up the hall till she stood right before the thrones. "A boon, O Queen!" she cried again. "Speak on, my sister, what is there that I can give thee who hath half our kingdom?" "Thou canst tell me a true word, me and the people of Zu Vendis. Art thou, or art thou not, about to take this foreign wolf," and she pointed to Sir Henry with her toy spear, "to be a husband to thee, and share thy bed and throne?" Curtis winced at this, and turning towards Sorais said to her in a low voice, "Methinks that yesterday thou hadst other names than wolf to call me by, O Queen." And I saw her bite her lips, as like a danger flag the blood flamed red upon her face. As for Nyleptha, who is nothing if not original, she, seeing that the thing was out, and that there was nothing further to be gained by concealment, answered the question in a novel and effectual manner, inspired thereto, as I firmly believe, by coquetry and a desire to triumph over her rival. Up she rose, and descending from the throne, swept in all the glory of her royal grace on to where her lover stood. There she stopped and untwined the golden snake that was wound around her arm. Then she bade him kneel, and he dropped on one knee on the marble before her. And next, taking the golden snake with both her hands, she bent the pure soft metal round his neck, and when it was fast, deliberately kissed him on the brow, and called him her dear lord. "Thou seest," she said, when the excited murmur of the spectators had died away, addressing her sister as Sir Henry rose to his feet. "I have put my collar round the wolf's neck, and behold he shall be my watchdog, and that is my answer to thee, Queen Sorais, my sister, and to those with thee. Fear not," she went on, smiling sweetly on her lover, and pointing to the golden snake she had twined round his massive throat. "If my yoke be heavy, yet it is of pure gold, and it shall not gall thee." Then, turning to the audience, she continued in a clear, proud tone, "I, Lady of the Night, lords, priests, and people here gathered together, by this sign do I take the foreigner to husband, even here in the face of you all. What, am I a queen, and yet not free to choose the man whom I will love? Then should I be lower than the meanest girl in all my provinces. Nay, he hath won my heart, and with it goes my hand, and throne, and all I have. Ay, had he been a beggar instead of a great lord, fairer and stronger than any here, and having more wisdom and knowledge of strange things, I had given him all, how much more so being what he is." And she took his hand and gazed proudly on him, and holding it, stood there boldly facing the people. And such was her sweetness, and the power and dignity of her person, and so beautiful she looked standing hand in hand there at her lover's side, so sure of him and of herself, and so ready to risk all things, and endure all things for him, that most of those who saw the sight, which I am sure no one of them will ever forget, caught the fire from her eyes and the happy colour from her blushing face, and cheered her like wild things. It was a bold stroke for her to make, and it appealed to the imagination, but human nature, in Zu-Vendis, as elsewhere, loves that which is bold and not afraid to break a rule, and is moreover peculiarly susceptible to appeals to its poetical side. And so the people cheered till the roof rang, but Sorais of the Night stood there with downcast eyes, for she could not bear to see her sister's triumph, which robbed her of the man whom she had hoped to win, and in the awfulness of her jealous anger she trembled and turned white like an aspen in the wind. I think I have said somewhere of her that she reminded me of the sea on a calm day, having the same aspect of sleeping power about her. Well, it was all awake now, and like the face of the furious ocean, it awed and yet fascinated me. A really handsome woman in a royal rage is always a beautiful sight, but such beauty and such a rage I never saw combined before, and I can only say that the effect produced was well worthy of the two. She lifted her white face, the teeth set, and there were purple rings beneath her glowing eyes. Thrice she tried to speak, and thrice she failed, but at last her voice came. Raising her silver spear, she shook it, and the light gleamed from it, and from the golden scales of her cuirass. "And thinkest thou, Nyleptha," she said in notes which pealed through the great hall like a clarion, "thinkest thou that I, Sorais, a queen of the Zu-Vendi, will brook that this base outlander shall sit upon my father's throne, and rear up half-breeds to fill the place of the great house of the stairway? Never, never, while there is life in my bosom and a man to follow me and a spear to strike with. Who is on my side? Who? Now hand thou over this foreign wolf, and those who came thither to pray with him to the doom of fire, for have they not committed the deadly sin against the sun? Or, Nyleptha, I give thee war, red war. Aye, I say to thee that the path of thy passion shall be marked out by the blazing of thy towns, and watered with the blood of those who cleave to thee. On thy head rests the burden of the deed, and in thy ears ring the groans of the dying, and the cries of the widows, and those who are left fatherless for ever and ever. I tell thee I will tear thee, Nyleptha, the White Queen, from thy throne, and that thou shalt be hurled, ay, hurled even from the topmost stair of the great way to the foot thereof, in that thou hast covered the name of the house of him who built it with black shame. And I tell ye strangers, all save Bougwan, whom because thou didst do me a service I will save alive, if thou wilt leave these men and follow me." Here poor Good shook his head vigorously and ejaculated, "Can't be done," in English. "That I will wrap you in sheets of gold and hang you yet alive in chains from the 4 golden trumpets of the 4 angels that fly east and west and north and south from the giddiest pinnacles of the temple, so that ye may be a token and a warning to the land. And as for thee, Incubu, thou shalt die in yet another fashion that I will not tell thee now." She ceased, panting for breath, for her passion shook her like a storm, and a murmur, partly of horror and partly of admiration, ran through the hall. Then Nyleptha answered calmly and with dignity, "Ill would it become my place and dignity, O sister, so to speak as thou hast spoken, and so to threat as thou hast threatened. Yet if thou wilt make war, then I will strive to bear up against thee. For if my hand seems soft, yet shalt thou find it of iron when it grips thine armies by the throat. Sorais, I fear thee not. I weep for that which thou wilt bring upon our people and on thyself. But for myself I say, I fear thee not. Yet thou, whom but yesterday didst strive to win my lover and my lord from me, whom today thou dost call a foreign wolf to be thy lover and thy lord." Here there was an immense sensation in the hall. "Thou who but last night, as I have learnt but since thou didst enter here, didst creep like a snake into my sleeping place, ay, even by a secret way, and wouldst have foully murdered me, thy sister, as I lay asleep." "It is false! It is false!" rang out Egon's and a score of other voices. "It is not false," said I, producing the broken point of the dagger and holding it up. "Where is the haft from which this flew, O Sorais?" "It is not false," cried Good, determined at last to act like a loyal man. "I took the Lady of the Night by the White Queen's bed, and on my breast the dagger broke." "Who is on my side?" cried Sorais, shaking her silver spear, for she saw that public sympathy was turning against her. "What, Bougwan, thou comest not?" she said, addressing Good, who was standing close to her, in a low concentrated voice. Thou pale-souled fool, for a reward thou shalt eat out thy heart with love of me, and not be satisfied. And thou mightest have been my husband and a king. At least I hold thee in chains that cannot be broken." "War! War! War!" she cried. "Here with my hand upon the sacred stone that shall endure, so runs the prophecy. Till the Zu-Vendi set their necks beneath an alien yoke, I declare war to the end. Who follows Sorais of the Night to victory and honour?" Instantly the whole concourse began to break up in indescribable confusion. Many present hastened to throw in their lot with the Lady of the Night, but some came from her following to us. Amongst the former was an under-officer of Nyleptha's own guard, who suddenly turned and made a run for the doorway through which Sorais' people were already passing. Umslopogaas, who was present and had taken the whole scene in, seeing with admirable presence of mind that if this soldier got away others would follow his example, seized the man, who drew his sword and struck at him. Thereon the Zulu sprang back with a wild shout, and avoiding the sword cuts, began to peck at his foe with his terrible axe, till in a few seconds the man's fate overtook him, and he fell with a clash heavily and quite dead upon the marble floor. This was the first blood spilt in the war. "Shut the gates!" I shouted, thinking that we might perhaps catch Sorais so, and not being troubled with the idea of committing sacrilege. But the order came too late. Her guards were already passing through them, and in another minute the streets echoed with the furious galloping of horses and the rolling of her chariots. So, drawing half the people after her, Sorais was soon passing like a whirlwind through the frowning city on her road to her headquarters at Marstuna, a fortress situated 130 miles to the north of Milosis. And after that the city was alive with the endless tramp of regiments and preparations for the gathering war, and old Umslopogaas once more began to sit in the sunshine and go through a show of sharpening Inkosi kaas's razor edge. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. A Strange Wedding. One person, however, did not succeed in getting out in time before the gates were shut, and that was the high priest Agon, who, as we had every reason to believe, was Sorais' great ally and the heart and soul of her party. This cunning and ferocious old man had not forgiven us for those hippopotami, or rather, that is what he said. What he meant was that he would never brook the introduction of our wider ways of thought and foreign learning and influence while there was a possibility of stamping us out. Also, he knew that we possessed a different system of religion, and no doubt was in daily terror of our attempting to introduce it into Zu-Vendis. One day he asked me if we had any religion in our country, and I told him that so far as I could remember we had 95 different ones. You might have knocked him down with a feather. And really it is difficult not to pity a high priest of a well-established cult who is haunted by the possible approach of one or all of 95 new religions. When we knew that Agon was caught, Nyleptha, Sir Henry and I discussed what was to be done with him. I was for closely incarcerating him, but Nyleptha shook her head, saying that it would produce a disastrous effect throughout the country. "Ah," she added, with a stamp of her foot, "if I win and am once really queen, I will break the power of those priests, with their rites and reveals and dark secret ways. I only wish that old Agon could have heard her. It would have frightened him." "Well," said Sir Henry, If we are not to imprison him, I suppose that we may as well let him go. He is of no use here." Nyleptha looked at him in a curious sort of way, and said in a dry little voice, "Thinkest thou so, my lord?" "Eh?" said Curtis. "No, I do not see what is the use of keeping him." She said nothing, but continued looking at him in a way that was as shy as it was sweet. Then at last he understood. "Forgive me, Nyleptha," he said rather tremulously. "Dost thou mean that thou wilt marry me even now?" "Nay, I know not. Let my lord say," was her rapid answer. "But if my lord wills, the priest is there and the altar is there," pointing to the entrance to a private chapel. "And am I not ready to do the will of my lord? Listen, O my lord. In 8 days or less thou must leave me and go down to war, for thou shalt lead my armies. And in war men sometimes fall, and so I would for a little space have had thee all my own, if only for memory's sake," and the tears overflowed her lovely eyes, and rolled down her face like heavy drops of dew down the red heart of a rose. "Mayhap, too," she went on, "I shall lose my crown, and with my crown my life, and thine also. Sorais is very strong and very bitter, and if she prevails she will not spare. Who can read the future? Happiness is the world's white bird that alights seldom and flies fast and far, till one day he is lost in the clouds. Therefore should we hold him fast if by any chance he rests for a little space upon our hand. It is not wise to neglect the present for the future, for who knows what the future will be, Incubu? Let us pluck our flowers while the dew is on them, for when the sun is up they wither, and on the morrow will others bloom that we shall never see." And she lifted her sweet face to him and smiled into his eyes, and once more I felt a curious pang of jealousy and turned and went away. They never took much notice of whether I was there or not, thinking, I suppose, that I was an old fool and that it did not matter one way or the other, and really I believe that they were right. So I went back to our quarters and ruminated over things in general, and watched old Umslopogaas whetting his axe outside the window as a vulture whets his beak beside a dying ox. And in about an hour's time Sir Henry came tearing over, looking very radiant and wildly excited, and found Good and myself and even Umslopogaas, and asked us if we should like to assist at a real wedding. Of course we said yes, and off we went to the chapel, where we found Agon looking as sulky as any high priest possibly could, and no wonder. It appeared that he and Nyleptha had a slight difference of opinion about the coming ceremony. He had flatly refused to celebrate it, or to allow any of his priests to do so, whereupon Nyleptha became very angry and told him that she, as queen, was head of the church and meant to be obeyed. Indeed, she played the part of a Zu Vendi Henry VIII to perfection, and insisted that if she wanted to be married, she would be married, and that he should marry her. End note. In Zu Vendis, members of the royal house can only be married by the high priest or a formally appointed deputy. Allan Quatermain. He still refused to go through the ceremony, so she clinched her argument thus: "Well, I cannot execute a high priest because there is an absurd prejudice against it, and I cannot imprison him because all his subordinates would raise a crying that would bring the stars down on Zu Vendis and crush it. But I can leave him to contemplate the altar of the sun without anything to eat, because that is his natural vocation, And if thou wilt not marry me, O Agon, thou shalt be placed before the altar yonder with naught but a little water, till such time as thou hast reconsidered the matter." Now, as it happened, Agon had been hurried away that morning without his breakfast, and was already exceedingly hungry. So he presently modified his views and consented to marry them, saying at the same time that he washed his hands of all responsibility in the matter. So it chanced that presently, attended only by two of her favourite maidens, came the Queen Nyleptha, with happy blushing face and downcast eyes, dressed in pure white, without embroidery of any sort, as seems to be the fashion on these occasions in most countries of the world. She did not wear a single ornament, even her gold circlets were removed, and I thought that if possible she looked more lovely than ever without them, as really superbly beautiful women do. She came, curtsied low to Sir Henry, and then took his hand and led him up before the altar, and after a little pause, in a slow, clear voice, uttered the following words, which are customary in Zu Vendis if the bride desires and the man consents: "Thou dost swear by the sun that thou wilt take no other woman to wife unless I lay my hand upon her and bid her come?" "I swear it," answered Sir Henry, adding in English, "one is quite enough for me." Then Agon, who had been sulking in a corner near the altar, came forward and gabbled off something into his beard at such a rate that I could not follow it, but it appeared to be an invocation to the sun to bless the union and make it fruitful. I observed that Nyleptha listened very closely to every word, and afterwards discovered that she was afraid lest Agon should play a trick, and by going through the invocations backwards divorce them instead of marry them. At the end of the invocations they were asked, as in our service, if they took each other for husband and wife, and on their assenting they kissed each other before the altar, and the service was over so far as their rights were concerned. But it seemed to me that there was yet something wanting, and so I produced a prayer book which has, together with the Ingoldsby Legends that I often read when I lie awake at night, accompanied me in all my later wanderings. I gave it to my poor boy Harry years ago, and after his death I found it among his things and took it back again. "Curtis," I said, "I am not a clergyman, and I do not know if what I am going to propose is allowable. I know it is not legal, but if you and the Queen have no objection, I should like to read the English marriage service over you. It is a solemn step which you are taking, and I think that you ought, so far as circumstances will allow, to give it the sanction of your own religion." "I have thought of that," he said, "and I wish you would. I do not feel half married yet." Nyleptha raised no objection, fully understanding that her husband wished to celebrate the marriage according to the rites prevailing in his own country, and so I set to work and read the service from "Dearly Beloved" to "Amazement" as well as I could, and when I came to "I, Henry, take thee, Nyleptha," I translated, and also "I, Nyleptha, take thee, Henry," which she repeated after me very well. Then Sir Henry took a plain gold ring from his little finger and placed it on hers, and so on to the end. The ring had been Curtis's mother's wedding ring, and I could not help thinking how astonished the old Yorkshire lady would have been if she could have foreseen that her wedding ring was to serve a similar purpose for Nyleptha, a queen of the Zu Vendi. As for Agon, he was with difficulty kept calm while this second ceremony was going on, for he at once understood that it was religious in its nature, and doubtless bethought him of the 95 new faiths which loomed so ominously in his eyes. Indeed, he at once set me down as a rival high priest, and hated me accordingly. However, in the end off he went, positively bristling with indignation, and I knew that we might look out for danger from his direction. And off went Good and I, and old Umslopogaas also, leaving the happy pair to themselves, and very low we all felt. Marriages are supposed to be cheerful things, but my experience is that they are very much the reverse to everybody, except perhaps the two people chiefly interested. They mean the breaking up of so many old ties, as well as the undertaking of so many new ones, and there was always something sad about the passing away of the old order. Now to take this case for instance. Sir Henry Curtis is the best and kindest fellow and friend in the world, but he has never been quite the same since that little scene in the chapel. It is always Nyleptha this and Nyleptha that, Nyleptha, in short, from morning till night in one way or another, either expressed or understood. And as for the old friends, well, of course, they have taken the place that old friends ought to take, and which ladies are as a rule very careful to see they do take when a man marries, and that is the second place. Yes, he would be angry if anybody said so, but it is a fact for all that. He is not quite the same, and Nyleptha is very sweet and very charming, but I think that she likes him to understand that she has married him and not Quatermain, Good and company. But there, what is the use of grumbling? It is all very right and proper, as any married lady would have no difficulty in explaining, and I am a selfish, jealous old man, though I hope I never show it. So Good and I went and ate in silence, and then indulged in an extra fine flagon of old Zuvendian to keep our spirits up, and presently one of our attendants came and told a story that gave us something to think about. It may, perhaps, be remembered that after his quarrel with Umslopogaas, Alphonse had gone off in an exceedingly ill temper to sulk over his scratches. Well, it appears that he had walked right past the Temple to the Sun, down the wide road on the further side of the slope it crowns, and thence on into the beautiful park or pleasure gardens which are laid out just beyond the outer wall. After wandering there for a little he started to return, but was met near the outer gate by Sorais' train of chariots, which were galloping furiously along the great northern road. When she caught sight of Alphonse, Sorais halted her train and called to him. On approaching he was instantly seized and dragged into one of the chariots and carried off, crying out loudly, as our informant said, and from my general knowledge of him I can well believe. At first I was much puzzled to know what object Sorais could have had in carrying off the poor little Frenchman. She could hardly stoop so low as to try to wreak her fury on one whom she knew was only a servant. At last, however, an idea occurred to me. We three were, as I think I have said, much revered by the people of Zuvendis at large, both because we were the first strangers they had ever seen, and because we were supposed to be the possessors of almost supernatural wisdom. Indeed, though Sorais' cry against the foreign wolves, or to translate it more accurately, foreign hyenas, was sure to go down very well with the nobles and the priests, it was not, as we learnt, likely to be particularly effectual amongst the bulk of the population. The Zu-Vendi people, like the Athenians of old, are ever seeking for some new thing, and just because we were so new our presence was on the whole acceptable to them. Again, Sir Henry's magnificent personal appearance made a deep impression upon a race who possess a greater love of beauty than any other I have ever been acquainted with. Beauty may be prized in other countries, but in Zu-Vendis it is almost worshipped, as indeed the national love of statuary shows. The people said openly in the marketplaces that there was not a man in the country to touch Curtis in personal appearance, as with the exception of Sorais there was no woman who could compete with Nyleptha, and that therefore it was meet that they should marry, and that he had been sent by the sun as a husband for their queen. Now from all this it will be seen that the outcry against us was to a considerable extent fictitious, and nobody knew it better than Sorais herself. Consequently it struck me that it might have occurred to her that down in the country and among the country people it would be better to place the reason of her conflict with her sister upon other and more general grounds than Nyleptha's marriage with the stranger. It would be easy in a land where there had been so many civil wars to rake out some old cry that would stir up the recollection of buried feuds, and indeed she soon found an effectual one. This being so, it was of great importance to her to have one of the strangers with her whom she could show to the common people as a great outlander who had been so struck by the justice of her cause that he had elected to leave his companions and follow her standard. This, no doubt, was the cause of her anxiety to get a hold of Good, whom she would have used till he ceased to be of service, and then cast off. But Good having drawn back, she grasped at the opportunity of securing Alphonse, who was not unlike him in personal appearance, though smaller, no doubt with the object of showing him off in the cities and country as the great Bougwan himself. I told Good that I thought that that was her plan, and his face was a sight to see, he was so horrified at the idea. "What," he said, "dress up that little wretch to represent me? Why, I should have to get out of the country. My reputation will be ruined for ever." I consoled him as well as I could, but it is not pleasant to be personated all over a strange country by an arrant little coward, and I can quite sympathize with his vexation. Well, that night Good and I messed, as I have said, in solitary grandeur, feeling very much as though we had just returned from burying a friend instead of marrying one, and next morning the work began in good earnest. The messages and orders which had been dispatched by Nyleptha 2 days before now began to take effect, and multitudes of armed men came pouring into the city. We saw, as may be imagined, but very little of Nyleptha, and not too much of Curtis during those next few days, but Good and I sat daily with the council of generals and loyal lords, drawing up plans of action, arranging commissariat matters, the distribution of commands, and 101 other things. Men came in freely, and all the day long the great roads leading to Milosis were spotted with the banners of lords arriving from their distant places to rally round Nyleptha. After the first few days it became clear that we should be able to take the field with about 40,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry, a very respectable force considering how short was the time we had to collect it, and that about half the regular army had elected to follow Sorais. But if our force was large, Sorais's was, according to the reports brought in day by our spies, much larger. She had taken up her headquarters at a very strong town called Marstuna, situated, as I have said, to the north of Milosis, and all the countryside was flocking to her standard. Nasta had poured down from his highlands, and was on his way to join her with no less than 25,000 of his mountaineers, the most terrible soldiers to face in all Zu-Vendis. Another mighty lord, named Belusha, who lived in the great horse-breeding district, had come in with 12,000 cavalry, and so on. Indeed, what between one thing and another, it seemed certain that she would gather a fully armed host of nearly 100,000 men. And then came news that Sorais was proposing to break up her camp and march on the frowning city itself, desolating the country as she came. Thereon arose the question whether it would be best to meet her at Milosis or to go out and give her battle. When our opinion was asked upon the subject, Good and I unhesitatingly gave it in favour of an advance. If we were to shut ourselves up in the city and wait to be attacked, it seemed to us that our inaction would be set down to fear. It is so very important, especially on an occasion of this sort, when a very little will suffice to turn men's opinions one way or the other, to be up and doing something. Ardour for a cause will soon evaporate if the cause does not move but sits down to conquer. Therefore we cast our vote for moving out and giving battle in the open, instead of waiting till we were drawn from our walls like a badger from a hole. Sir Henry's opinion coincided with ours, and so, needless to say, did that of Nyleptha, who, like a flint, was always ready to flash out fire. A great map of the country was brought and spread out before her. About 30 miles this side of Marstuna, where Sorais lay, and 90-odd miles from Milosis, the road ran over a neck of land some 2.5 miles in width, and flanked on either side by forest-clad hills, which, without being lofty, would, if the road were blocked, be quite impractical for a great baggage-laden army to cross. She looked earnestly at the map, and then, with a quickness of perception that in some women amounts almost to an instinct, she laid her finger upon this neck of rising ground, and turning to her husband said with a proud air of confidence and a toss of the golden head, "Here shalt thou meet Sorais' armies. I know the spot. Here shalt thou meet them, and drive them before thee like dust before the storm." But Curtis looked grave and said nothing. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. The Battle of the Pass. It was on the third morning after this incident of the map that Sir Henry and I started. With the exception of a small guard, all the great host had moved on the night before, leaving the frowning city very silent and empty. Indeed, it was found impossible to leave any garrison, with the exception of a personal guard for Nyleptha, and about 1,000 men who, from sickness or one cause or another, were unable to proceed with the army. But as Milosis was practically impregnable, and as our enemy was in front of and not behind us, this did not so much matter. Good and Umslopogaas had gone on with the army, but Nyleptha accompanied Sir Henry and myself to the city gates, riding a magnificent white horse called Daylight, which was supposed to be the fleetest and most enduring animal in Zu-Vendis. Her face bore traces of recent weeping, but there were no tears in her eyes now. Indeed, she was bearing up bravely against what must have been a bitter trial to her. At the gate she reined in her horse and bade us farewell. On the previous day she had reviewed and addressed the officers of the great army, speaking to them such high, eloquent words, and expressing so complete a confidence in their valour and in their ultimate victory, that she quite carried their hearts away, and as she rode from rank to rank they cheered her till the ground shook. And now today the same mood seemed to be on her. "Fare thee well, Macumazahn," she said. "Remember, I trust to thy wits, which are as a needle to a spear handle compared to those of my people, to save us from Sorais. I know that thou wilt do thy duty." I bowed and explained to her my horror of fighting, and my fear lest I should lose my head, at which she laughed gently and turned to Curtis. "Fare thee well, my lord," she said. "Come back with victory and as a king, or on thy soldiers' spears." End note. Alluding to the Zu-Vendi custom of carrying dead officers on a framework of spears. Sir Henry said nothing, but turned his horse to go. Perhaps he had a bit of a lump in his throat. One gets over it afterwards, but these sort of partings are trying when one has only been married a week. "Here," added Nyleptha, "will I greet thee when ye return in triumph. And now, my lords, once more farewell." Then we rode on. But when we had gone 150 yards or so, we turned and perceived her still sitting on her horse at the same spot, and looking out after us beneath her hand, and that was the last we saw of her. About a mile farther on, however, we heard galloping behind us, and looking round saw a mounted soldier coming towards us, leading Nyleptha's matchless steed, Daylight. "The Queen sends the white stallion as a farewell gift to her lord Incubu, and bids me tell my lord that he is the fleetest and most enduring horse in all the land," said the soldier, bending to his saddle bow before us. At first Sir Henry did not want to take the horse, saying that he was too good for such rough work, but I persuaded him to do so, thinking that Nyleptha would be hurt if he did not. Little did I guess at the time what service that noble horse would render in our sorest need. It is curious to look back and realize upon what trivial and apparently coincidental circumstances great events frequently turn as easily and naturally as a door on its hinges. Well, we took the horse, and a beauty he was. It was a perfect pleasure to see him move. And Curtis having sent back his greetings and thanks, we proceeded on our journey. By midday we overtook the rear guard of the great army of which Sir Henry then formally took over the command. It was a heavy responsibility, and it oppressed him very much, but the Queen's injunctions on the point were such as did not admit of being trifled with. He was beginning to find out that greatness has its responsibilities as well as its glories. Then we marched on without meeting any opposition, almost indeed without seeing anybody, for the populations of the towns and villages along our route had for the most part fled, fearing lest they should be caught between the two rival armies and ground to powder like grain between the upper and nether stones. On the evening of the fourth day, for the progress of so great a multitude was necessarily slow, we camped 2 miles this side of the neck or ridge I have spoken of, and our outposts brought us word that Sorais with all her power was rolling down upon us, and had pitched her camp that night 10 miles the farther side of the neck. Accordingly, before dawn, we sent forward 1,500 cavalry to seize the position. Scarcely had they occupied it, however, before they were attacked by about as many of Sorais' horsemen, and a very smart little cavalry fight ensued, with a loss to us of about 30 men killed. On the advance of our supports, however, Sorais' force drew off, carrying their dead and wounded with them. The main body of the army reached the neck about dinner time, and I must say that Nyleptha's judgment had not failed her. It was an admirable place to give battle in, especially to a superior force. The road ran down a mile or more through ground too broken to admit of the handling of any considerable force, till it reached the crest of a great green wave of land that rolled down a gentle slope to the banks of a little stream, and then rolled away again up a still gentler slope to the plain beyond, the distance from the crest of the land wave down to the stream being a little over half a mile, and from the stream up to the plain beyond a trifle less. The length of this wave of land at its highest point, which corresponded exactly with the width of the neck of the land between the wooded hills, was about 2 miles and a quarter, and it was protected on either side by dense, rocky, bush-clad ground that afforded a most valuable cover to the flanks of the army, and rendered it almost impossible for them to be turned. It was on the hither slope of this neck of land that Curtis encamped his army in the same formation that he had, after consultation with the various generals, Good and myself, determined that they should occupy in the great pitched battle which now appeared to be imminent. Our force of 60,000 men was, roughly speaking, divided as follows. In the centre was a dense body of 20,000 foot soldiers, armed with spears, swords, and hippopotamus hide shields, breast and backplates. End note. The Zu-Vendi people do not use bows. Allan Quatermain. These formed the chest of the army, and were supported by 5,000 foot and 3,000 horse in reserve. On either side of this chest were stationed 7,000 horse, arranged in deep, majestic squadrons, and beyond and on either side, but slightly in front of them again, were two bodies, each numbering about 7,500 spearmen, forming the right and left wings of the army, and each supported by a contingent of some 1,500 cavalry. This makes in all 60,000 men. Curtis commanded in chief. I was in command of the 7,000 horse between the chest and right wing, which was commanded by Good, and the other battalions and squadrons were entrusted to Zu-Vendis generals. Scarcely had we taken up our positions before Sorais' vast army began to swarm on the opposite slope about a mile in front of us, till the whole place seemed alive with the multitude of her spear points, and the ground shook with the tramp of her battalions. It was evident that the spies had not exaggerated. We were outnumbered by at least a third. At first we expected that Sorais was going to attack us at once, as the clouds of cavalry which hung upon her flanks executed some threatening demonstrations. But she thought better of it, and there was no fight that day. As for the formation of her great forces, I cannot now describe it with accuracy, and it would only serve to bewilder if I did. But I may say generally that in its leading features it resembled our own, only her reserve was much greater. Opposite our right wing, and forming Sorais' left wing, was a great army of dark, wild-looking men, armed with sword and shield only, which I was informed was composed of Nasta's 25,000 savage hillsmen. "My word, Good," said I when I saw them, "you will catch it tomorrow when those gentlemen charge," whereat Good, not unnaturally, looked rather anxious. All day we watched and waited, but nothing happened, and at last night fell, and 1,000 watchfires twinkled brightly on the slopes, to wane and die one by one like the stars they resembled. As the hours wore on, the silence gradually gathered more deeply over the opposing hosts. It was a very wearying night, for in addition to the endless things that had to be attended to, there was our gnawing suspense to reckon with. The fray which tomorrow would witness would be so vast, and the slaughter so awful, that stout indeed must the heart have been that was not overwhelmed at the prospect. And when I thought of all that hung upon it, I own I felt ill, and it made me very sad to reflect that these mighty forces were gathered for destruction simply to gratify the jealous anger of a woman. This was the hidden power which was to send those dense masses of cavalry flashing like human thunderbolts across the plain, and to roll together the fierce battalions as clouds when hurricane meets hurricane. It was a dreadful thought, and set one wondering about the responsibilities of the great ones of the earth. Deep into the night we sat, with pale faces and heavy hearts, and took counsel, whilst the sentries tramped up and down, down and up, and the armed and plumed generals came and went, grim and shadow-like. And so the time wore away, till everything was ready for the coming slaughter, and I lay down and thought, and tried to get a little rest, but could not sleep for fear of the morrow, for who could say what the morrow would bring forth? Misery and death, this was certain. Beyond that we knew not, and I confess I was very much afraid. But as I realized then, it is useless to question that eternal Sphinx, the future. From day to day she reads aloud the riddles of the yesterday, of which the puzzled worldlings of all ages have not answered one, nor ever will, guess they never so wildly, or cry they never so loud. And so at length I gave up wondering, being forced humbly to leave the issue in the balancing hands of Providence and the morrow. And at last up came the red sun, and the huge camps awoke with a clash and a roar, and gathered themselves together for battle. It was a beautiful and awe-inspiring scene, and old Umslopogaas, leaning on his axe, contemplated it with grim delight. "Never have I seen the like, Macumazahn, never," he said. "The battles of my people are as the play of children to what this will be. Thinkest thou that they will fight it out?" "Ay," I answered sadly, "to the death. Content thyself, woodpecker, for once shalt thou peck thy fill." Time went on, and still there was no sign of an attack. A force of cavalry crossed the brook, indeed, and rode slowly along our front, evidently taking stock of our position and numbers. With this we did not attempt to interfere, as our decision was to stand strictly on the defensive and not to waste a single man. The men breakfasted and stood to their arms, and the hours wore on. About midday, when the men were eating their dinner, for we thought they would fight better on full stomachs, a shout of "Sorais! Sorais!" arose like thunder from the enemy's extreme right, and taking the glass I was able to clearly distinguish the Lady of the Night herself, surrounded by a glittering staff and riding slowly down the lines of her battalions. And as she went, that mighty thundering shout rolled along before her like the rolling of 10,000 chariots, or the roaring of the ocean when the gale turns suddenly and carries the noise of it to the listener's ears, till the earth shook and the air was full of the majesty of sound. Guessing that this was a prelude to the beginning of the battle, we remained still and made ready. We had not long to wait. Suddenly, like flame from a cannon's mouth, out shot two great tongue-like forces of cavalry, and came charging down the slope towards the little stream, slowly at first, but gathering speed as they came. Before they got to the stream, orders reached me from Sir Henry, who evidently feared that the shock of such a charge, if allowed to fall unbroken upon our infantry, would be too much for them, to send 5,000 sabres to meet the force opposite to me, at the moment when it began to mount the stiffest of the rise about 400 yards from our lines. This I did, remaining behind myself with the rest of my men. Off went the 5,000 horsemen, drawn up in a wedge-like form, and I must say that the general in command handled them very ably. Starting at a hand gallop, for the first 300 yards he rode straight at the tip of the tongue-shaped mass of cavalry which, numbering so far as I could judge about 8,000 sabres, was advancing to charge us. Then he suddenly swerved to the right and put on the pace, and I saw the great wedge curl round, and before the foe could check himself and turn to meet it, strike him about halfway down his length, with a crashing, rending sound like that of the breaking up of vast sheets of ice. In sank the great wedge into his heart, and as it cut its way hundreds of horsemen were thrown up on either side of it, just as the earth is thrown up by a ploughshare, or more like still, as the foaming water curls over beneath the bows of a rushing ship. In, yet in, vainly does the tongue twist its ends round in agony, like an injured snake, and strive to protect its centre. Still farther in, by heaven! Right through, and so, amid cheer after cheer from our watching thousands, back again upon the severed ends, beating them down, driving them as a gale drives spray, till at last, amidst the rushing of hundreds of riderless horses, the flashing of swords, and the victorious clamour of their pursuers, the great force crumples up like an empty glove, then turns and gallops pell-mell for safety back to its own lines. I do not think it reached them more than 2/3 as strong as when it went out 10 minutes before. The lines, which were now advancing to the attack, opened and swallowed them up, and my force returned, having only suffered a loss of about 500 men. Not much, I thought, considering the fierceness of the struggle. I could also see that the opposing bodies of cavalry on our left wing were drawing back, but how the fight went with them I do not quite know. It is as much as I can do to describe what took place immediately around me. By this time the dense masses of the enemy's left, composed almost entirely of Nasta's swordsmen, were across the little stream, and with alternate yells of Nasta and Sorais, with dancing banners and gleaming swords, were swarming up towards us like ants. Again I received orders to try and check this movement, and also the main advance against the chest of our army, by means of cavalry charges, and this I did to the best of my ability by continually sending squadrons of about 1,000 sabres out against them. These squadrons did the enemy much damage, and it was a glorious sight to see them flash down the hillside and bury themselves like a living knife in the heart of the foe. But also we lost many men, for after the experience of a couple of these charges, which had drawn a sort of bloody St. Andrew's cross of dead and dying through the centre of Nasta's host, our foes no longer attempted to offer an unyielding front to their irresistible weight, but opened out to let the rush go through, throwing themselves on the ground and hamstringing hundreds of horses as they passed. And so, Notwithstanding all that we could do, the enemy drew nearer, till at last he hurled himself upon Good's force of 7,500 regulars, who were drawn up to receive them in 3 strong squares. About the same time, too, an awful and heart-shaking roar told me that the main battle had closed in on the centre and extreme left. I raised myself in my stirrups and looked down to my left. So far as the eye could see there was a long dazzling shimmer of steel as the sun glanced upon falling sword and thrusting spear. To and fro swung the contending lines in that dread struggle, now giving way, now gaining a little, in the mad yet ordered confusion of attack and defence. But it was as much as I could do to keep count of what was happening to our own wing, and as for the moment the cavalry had fallen back under cover of Good's 3 squares, I had a fair view of this. Nasta's wild swordsmen were now breaking in red waves against the sullen rock-like squares. Time after time did they yell out their war cries, and hurl themselves furiously against the long triple ridges of spear points, only to be rolled back as billows are when they meet the cliff. And so for 4 long hours the battle raged, almost without a pause. And at the end of that time, if we had gained nothing, we had lost nothing. 2 attempts to turn our left flank by forcing a way through the woods by which it was protected had been defeated, and as yet Nasta's swordsmen had, notwithstanding their desperate efforts, entirely failed to break Good's 3 squares, though they had thinned their numbers by quite a third. As for the chest of the army, where Sir Henry was with his staff and Umslopogaas, it had suffered dreadfully, but it had held its own with honour, and the same may be said of our left battle. At last the attack slackened, and Sorais' army drew back, having, I begin to think, had enough of it. On this point, however, I was soon undeceived, for splitting up her cavalry into comparatively small squadrons, she charged us furiously with them, all along the line, and then once more sullenly rolled her tens of thousands of sword and spearmen down upon our weakened squares and squadrons, Sorais herself directing the movement, as fearless as a lioness heading the main attack. On they came like an avalanche. I saw her golden helm gleaming in the van, our counter-charges of cavalry entirely failing to check their forward sweep. Now they had struck us, and our centre bent in like a bow beneath the weight of their rush. It parted, and had not the 10,000 men in reserve charged down to its support, it must have been utterly destroyed. As for Good's 3 squares, they were swept backwards like boats upon an incoming tide, and the foremost one was burst into and lost half its remaining men. But the effort was too fierce and terrible to last. Suddenly the battle came, as it were, to a turning point, and for a minute or two stood still. Then it began to move toward Sorais' camp. Just then, too, Nasta's fierce and almost invincible Highlanders, either because they were disheartened by their losses or by way of a ruse, fell back, and the remains of Good's gallant squares, leaving the positions they had held for so many hours, cheered wildly and rashly followed them down the slope, whereon the swarms of swordsmen turned to envelop them, and once more flung themselves upon them with a yell. Taken thus on every side, what remained of the first square was quickly destroyed, and I perceived that the second, in which I could see Good himself mounted on a large horse, was on the point of annihilation. A few more minutes and it was broken, its streaming colours sank, and I lost sight of Good in the confused and hideous slaughter that ensued. Presently, however, a cream-coloured horse with a snow-white mane and tail burst from the ruins of the square and came rushing past me, riderless and with wide streaming reins, and in it I recognized the charger that Good had been riding. Then I hesitated no longer, but taking with me half my effective cavalry force, which now amounted to between 4,000 and 5,000 men, I commended myself to God, and without waiting for orders, I charged straight down upon Nasta's swordsmen. Seeing me coming, and being warned by the thunder of my horse's hoofs, the majority of them faced round, and gave us a right warm welcome. Not an inch would they yield. In vain did we hack and trample them down as we ploughed a broad red furrow through their thousands. They seemed to re-arise by hundreds, driving their terrible sharp swords into our horses or severing their hamstrings, and then hacking the troopers who came to the ground with them almost into pieces. My horse was speedily killed under me, but luckily I had a fresh one, my own favourite, a coal-black mare Nyleptha had given me, being held in reserve behind, and on this I afterwards mounted. Meanwhile I had to get along as best I could, for I was pretty well lost sight of by my men in the mad confusion of the moment. My voice, of course, could not be heard in the midst of the clanging of steel and the shrieks of rage and agony. Presently I found myself mixed up with the remnants of the square, which had formed round its leader, Good, and was fighting desperately for existence. I stumbled against somebody, and glancing down, caught sight of Good's eyeglass. He had been beaten to his knee. Over him was a great fellow swinging a heavy sword. Somehow I managed to run the man through with the sime I had taken from the Masai, whose hand I had cut off. But as I did so, he dealt me a frightful blow on the left side and breast with the sword, and though my chain shirt saved my life, I felt that I was badly hurt. For a minute I fell on to my hands and knees among the dead and dying, and turned sick and faint. When I came to again, I saw that Nasta's spearmen, or rather those of them who remained, were retreating back across the stream, and that Good was there by me, smiling sweetly. "Near go, that," he shouted, "but all's well that ends well." I assented, but I could not help feeling that it had not ended well for me. I was sorely hurt. Just then we saw the smaller bodies of cavalry stationed on our extreme right and left, and which were now reinforced by the 3,000 sabres which we had held in reserve, flash out like arrows from their posts and fall upon the disordered flanks of Sorais' forces, and that charge decided the issue of the battle. In another minute or two the enemy was in slow and sullen retreat across the little stream, where they once more reformed. Then came another lull, during which I managed to get a second horse, and received my orders to advance from Sir Henry, and then with one fierce deep-throated roar, with a waving of banners and a wide flashing of steel, the remains of our army took the offensive and began to sweep down, slowly indeed, but irresistibly, from the positions they had so gallantly held all day. At last it was our turn to attack. On we moved, over the piled-up masses of dead and dying, and were approaching the stream, when suddenly I perceived an extraordinary sight. galloping wildly towards us, his arms tightly clasped around his horse's neck, against which his blanched cheek was tightly pressed, was a man arrayed in the full costume of a Zu-Vendi general, but in whom, as he came nearer, I recognized none other than our lost Alphonse. It was impossible even then to mistake those curling mustachios. In a minute he was tearing through our ranks and narrowly escaped being cut down, till at last somebody caught his horse's bridle, and he was brought to me just as a momentary halt occurred in our advance to allow what remained of our shattered squares to form into line. "Ah, monsieur," he gasped out in a voice that was nearly inarticulate with fright, "grace to the sky, it is you! Ah, what I have endured! But you win, monsieur, you win! They fly, the lâches! But listen, monsieur, I forget, it is no good. The Queen is to be murdered tomorrow at the first light in the palace of Milosis. Her guards will leave their posts and the priests are going to kill her. Ah, yes, they little thought it, but I was ensconced beneath a banner, and I heard it all." "What?" I said, horror-struck. "What do you mean?" "What I say, monsieur. That devil of a Nasta, he went last night to settle the affair with the Archbishop, Agon. The guard will leave open the little gate leading from the great stair and go away, and Nasta and Agon's priests will come in and kill her. Themselves they would not kill her." "Come with me," I said, and shouting to the staff officer next to me to take over the command, I snatched his bridle and galloped as hard as I could for the spot, between a quarter and half a mile off, where I saw the royal pennon flying, and where I knew that I should find Curtis if he were still alive. On we tore, our horses clearing heaps of dead and dying men, and splashing through pools of blood, on past the long broken lines of spearmen to where, mounted on the white stallion Nyleptha had sent to him as a parting gift, I saw Sir Henry's form towering above the generals who surrounded him. Just as we reached him the advance began again. A bloody cloth was bound around his head, but I saw that his eye was as bright and keen as ever. Beside him was old Umslopogaas, his axe red with blood, but looking quite fresh and uninjured. "What's wrong, Quatermain?" he shouted. "Everything. There is a plot to murder the Queen tomorrow at dawn. Alphonse here, who has just escaped from Sorais, has overheard it all," and I rapidly repeated to him what the Frenchman had told me. Curtis's face turned deadly pale and his jaw dropped. "At dawn!" he gasped, "and it is now sunset. It dawns before 4, and we are nearly 100 miles off. 9 hours at the outside. What is to be done?" An idea entered into my head. "Is that horse of yours fresh?" I said. "Yes, I have only just got on to him when my last was killed, and he has been fed." "So was mine. Get off him, and let Umslopogaas mount. He can ride well. We will be at Milosis before dawn, or if we are not, well, we cannot help it. No, no, it is impossible for you to leave now. You would be seen, and it would turn the fate of the battle. It is not half won yet. The soldiers would think you were making a bolt of it. Quick now." In a moment he was down, and at my bidding Umslopogaas sprang into the empty saddle. "Now farewell," I said. "Send 1,000 horsemen with remounts after us in an hour if possible. Stay, dispatch a general to the left wing to take over the command and explain my absence." "You will do your best to save her, Quatermain," he said in a broken voice. "Ay, that I will. Go on, you are being left behind." He cast one glance at us, and accompanied by his staff galloped off to join the advance, which by this time was fording the little brook that now ran red with the blood of the fallen. As for Umslopogaas and myself, we left that dreadful field as arrows leave a bow, and in a few minutes had passed right out of the sight of slaughter, the smell of blood, and the turmoil and shouting, which only came to our ears as a faint, far-off roaring like the sound of distant breakers. End of chapter 20.